Well, good morning and welcome to day 2 of our crop hour focused on corn this week. My name is Connie Strunk, and I'm a plant pathology field specialist with SDSU Extension. I will be your host and facilitator today. We are privileged to have with us 2 different speakers. The first one will be Dr. Johnathan Kleinjan. He is our Extension Agronomist here in the eastern side of the state, and he's going to be talking about giving a corn agronomic update, where he's going to focus on phantom yield loss, early versus late relative maturity, and more. And then following Dr. Kleinjan, we will have Sarah Bowder. She is our extension forage field specialist, and she's going to give an update on some corn silage management, kind of some tips and considerations and things to think about. A little bit of housekeeping here. If you have a question throughout today, go ahead and drop it in the chat or the Q&A feature, which is found at the bottom of your screen. Go ahead and put those questions in at any time throughout today. We will also have, following each speaker, a brief 3-question poll. So we would really encourage you and welcome your answers to those polls. You will find that a few of our speakers do have some questions and polls throughout to kind of make it a little bit more interactive. So we encourage you to play along with us with that. And then at the end of today's session, I will be showing a QR code for CCA credits. I'll only be showing that code once here at the live session. I'll give you a few minutes to get that scanned in. It will not be available in the recording. So I'll show that at the very end. And then I just wanted to have you be on the lookout for a weekly survey that will be sent out to your email later, just really encompassing the whole week and some tips, tricks, and things that our presenters and us as Extension can put together for our program. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Kleinjan, allow him to share his screen and start. Thank you.
Okay, I'm assuming everyone can see my slides here. I'm going to try to turn on the laser pointer, if I can find it. Spotlight. Well, maybe I'll just use my cursor. So anyway, thanks for the introduction, Connie. As she said, I'm the extension agronomist here in Brookings on the eastern side of the state. And part of my job is running the variety trials, so corn, soybeans, and wheat. Today we're focusing on corn, obviously, so we'll go ahead and get started. It's a little bit difficult sometimes for me to come up with topics to talk to you guys about that haven't already been solved by industry or, just basically practical studies for corn. It seems like sometimes we just reinvent the wheel every year. So I'm trying to come up with some stuff today to keep you guys informed on some things that I've seen over the last year. The first thing we're going to talk about is just South Dakota corn yields in 2022, what I saw in my trials, and then some numbers from the USDA on how South Dakota did in 2022. Phantom yield loss, I decided to discuss that a little bit because I had a few questions about that over the last year. So I dug into that, did a little bit of lit review. And then finally, I've been working on a data planting by maturity study in corn for 3 years now. So I'm going to summarize what I've seen over the last 3 years and present that to you today. So to get started, we'll look at the corn yields in 2022. And just as a reminder, I showed this last year, and I'm sure most of you in the corn industry are well aware of this, but corn uses the most water once we get to right about the tasseling stage here, which is the R1 stage, which is about 80 days after planting. So in South Dakota, if we're going to be planting, let's say May 1st to May 10th, this is going to put us right toward the end of July. So knowing that, it's a good thing to look at the drought monitor or soil conditions, precipitation conditions at that point in time. So let's just look at a comparison between last year and this year. So everyone remembers 2021, we were very dry. And here on the left, I have the drought monitor photo from July 27th of 2021. And then let's compare that to basically a year later, July 26th of this last year. So given the map, we were in a lot better shape, according to the folks that make these drought monitor maps. You know, obviously, we still had some dry areas in the state. The southeast corner, Fort Pierre area was very dry this year, but the corn belt for the most part, especially the northern 2/3, looks like it was in pretty good shape at that critical time for corn yield production. Moving on, we will look at my trials in 2022. So just to explain how this works, wherever there's a box is where I had a testing location for corn hybrids, right? The top number, if you look over here, is the 5-year average, and the bottom number is the trial average for 2022. And if the number is green, that means the yields were better than the 5-year average, and if it's red, that means they were worse. We had a testing site in Miller. We lost that to one of those wonderful Direcos that we had. I think that one came through right around the 4th of July. And then we had a testing site in Reliance too for corn. I'm not sure what happened there. It was extremely dry down there. And by the time we got down to harvest it, the ears had dropped off to the point where we would not have had usable data. So unfortunately, I don't have any data from Han County or Lyman County this year. But anyway, looking at what we do have, very good yields, and I'd say the eastern sliver of the state. Even though if we look back, the drought monitor, we were a little bit dry here. We had very good yields in Brookings. In fact, that's probably a record. We averaged almost 280 bushels an acre. I think just a function of being on the right soil type and being under the right rain cloud. And honestly, that's probably the story of the state this year. If you just happen to get the right rain at the right time, it was the difference between having an average crop and a very good crop. So little bit below normal in Bancroft, which is just north of DeSmet. And then down here in Mount Vernon, they were pretty dry all year. So you can see we were 36 bushels below our 5-year average down there. And we had a new testing site in Renner, just north of Sioux Falls this year. And the 5-year average, the reason there's an asterisk there is I don't have a 5-year average. So that is the average. And for some reason, it's not letting me advance the slide. Here we go. Okay, compare and contrast last year to this year. So I just popped up the numbers from 2021. Last year in the CPT statewide, we averaged 215, and or the 5-year average, excuse me, was 215, and the average for 2021 was 180. Versus this year, the CPT average, 5-year average was 206, but we averaged quite a bit above that, which is odd because the drought monitor, we should have been in worse shape. CPT, it showed that we were in worse shape last year, but when you look at the USDA numbers, actually South Dakota had a worse yield in 2022 than in 2021, which is very odd considering the drought maps that I just showed you. So I'm not quite sure what's going on there. Like I said, CPT, we had a better year in 2022. USDA, according to them, we had a worse year, even though the drought abated somewhat. So anyway, just something interesting I wanted to point out to you guys. I still have not hit 300 bushels an acre in my trials, although Brookings this year we came very close. Here's just a snapshot of the top of our late season trial in Brookings, and you can see the winner. I'm not specifically promoting any hybrids here or any companies, but the winner was 299.7. So I guess if I wanted to round to the nearest 1 decimal place or 0 decimal places, I would have hit 300 bushels an acre. But so far, I still have not done it. We've had individual plots go as high as like 315 bushel, but I have not had a replicated trial average over 300 bushels an acre yet. So maybe next year. Let's look at early versus late maturities, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the talk today too. Each location here has a split of maturities, right? So the middle two here, I'd say latitudes in the state, Bancroft and Brookings, we have a split at 100-day corn. So 100-day and below is considered early, and 101-day and above is considered late. Bath and South Shore, the more northern locations, that split is between 95 and 96-day. And then Mount Vernon and Renner, it's between 102 and 103-day. So if we look at the statewide average, late versus early hybrids, we had about a 7 bushel difference this year. And remember, this is just an average of all hybrids tested in my designated maturity groups, I guess you'd say. I've noticed this year over year, and if it tends to be a higher yield environment or good growing conditions, the later corn tends to do a little bit better. Like you look at some of our higher yielding locations here, Renner, Brookings, Bath, we had a 10+ bushel advantage to the late corn. Whereas if you run into trouble, dry year, things like that, it doesn't really make a difference what maturity corn you plant. So anyway, just to note that, like I said, we're going to discuss that a little bit further on in the talk. Looking at the yields in the trials over the last 20 years, this is just a scatter plot. Going back to 2003, we have bushels per acre in the left here on the y-axis, and then year on the bottom. And you can see we've gone from about 160 bushels an acre average up to about 220 in my program, CPT. So if you look at the slope of the line, that's roughly about 3 bushels an acre a year that we're increasing. So good to see that. I would say the last couple of years we were kind of right on trend line this year, but last year probably brought the average down. We had been increasing at a little bit quicker rate until the last 2 years of drought. Let's just look at the USDA yields for South Dakota. They're not increasing at quite the same pace. Look, judging by the slope here, it's about 2 bushels an acre a year, and they're going from a lower level back in 2003 of about 120 up to about 150, 160. So the reasons for that, why does the CPT have higher yields? Well, I'd say the main thing is we're on the better soil types at each of our testing locations. That's probably number one. Number two is we're probably testing some of the better genetics. And we're in number three, we're in probably the better parts of the Corn Belt for the most part in South Dakota. And then number four, we try to do a pretty good job of management. We have a precision planter and we just try to do everything right. So that's probably why, you know, the CPT yields, the top end, we're about 50, 60 bushels an acre better than the statewide average. So anyway, I just thought you guys might want to see some of those yield trends. With that, we'll move on to phantom yield loss. Like I said earlier, I had a few questions about this this summer and fall, so I thought I would dig into it just a little bit here. And what is phantom yield loss? I'm going to explain it here a little bit, and then I'm going to ask you guys a poll and see if you guys think you've experienced it yourself. So basically, the idea of this kind of started back in I think in the 70s. The USDA came out with numbers that said yields at harvest later in the year were not as good as harvest early in the year, which makes sense to most of us, right? But then seed companies and people and farmers, producers started to ask questions about this a little bit more. So Bob Nielsen looked at it in Purdue in 1991 to 1994. We'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. And that's probably the first study that actually examined this. The theory is in seed physiology that the seed continues to respire or through physiological maturity and lose weight. So, right, I mean, we lose weight through respiration too. We exhale carbon dioxide, and it's very minimal, but basically seeds are the same way. They use their energy and oxygen to respire and release carbon dioxide. So the thought is, as the seed progresses through physiological maturity and beyond, it's continuing to respire and lose weight, lose dry matter. I would say that most research has showed that to be not likely because the seed is pretty much done respiring once it reaches black layer. Anything that happens after that is pretty minimal, although there are temperature and moisture caveats to that as well. So anyway, like I said, this research was first reported by Bob Nielsen out at Purdue, 1991 and 94. We'll look at that on the next slide. And I would say that subsequent research, whether it's been industry or university, has been fairly inconsistent. And I'm just going to look at a couple of studies from Iowa State and then a recent study that we did here at South Dakota State. So with that, Lindsay, would you put up the first polling question? Answers are rolling in here. We'll give it a few more seconds here. Okay, I think we'll call it here. So the results of the poll, I don't know if everyone can see that. We had 18% say yes, they've experienced it, 18% say no, and 64% said that they don't know. So with that, I'll continue. So that's good for me to know. Okay, here's a slide showing the results. Well, one location of the Purdue study in 1991 to 94. They did this at their research farm in West Lafayette. And what they did basically is they came along at certain points in time, starting when the seed was at about 40% moisture. And they picked 5 ears, shelled it out, dried it down, and then they did a seed weight, right? 100 kernel dry weight. And they did this at certain points until the grain got down to about 15% moisture. So what they saw, and I believe there's an error in this table, because the negative slope should be over on this blue line and this one should be over here, but unless I'm really interpreting something wrong there. But they saw the dry weight of the kernel continued to increase until they got to 25% moisture, and then it began to decrease down to about 15% moisture. And then, like I said, this is their hand harvest method. They saw this in 3 or 4 years. I believe 1993, they didn't see any difference at all. But other 4 years, they saw this trend. So they came up with a number. There was quite a bit of variation there, but they came up with a number that there's 1% dry matter loss for every point of moisture from 28%, which would be here, down to about 18%. So basically, you could lose 10% of your yield in theory, according to their calculations, right? So like I said, this is kind of the initial study that laid the groundwork for this. There's been a lot of debate on it ever since. We'll look at a couple more studies here, and then we'll talk about it at the end. So moving on, I'd say that the most recent one that I found that looked at it comprehensively would be Iowa State in 2016, 2017. And this is just a brief summary of what they saw. They looked at a bunch of different things, including protein concentration and all that. But I thought this chart or these tables were most relevant to our discussion today. They again harvested ears and weighed the kernels from periods beginning about September 10th. If you look on the bottom here, we have day of the year. They use the Julian calendar, so numbers from 255 to 305, which would be roughly September 1st to November 1st, if I got my math right. And I tried to put that on the bottom here. But they looked at kernel weight at various times from September 1st through November 1st. At these 2 locations in 2016, or I'm sorry, this is 1 location in 2 years. But basically, you can see there was no change in kernel weight, and maybe even a slight increase in 2017 at this location. But what they also record is ear drop, and they notice that as the season progresses, you're starting to lose ears. They don't have any data for this site here, but let's look at the next location that they did. Basically the same trends in 2016, 2017. 2016, they maybe had a slight decrease in kernel weight as the season progressed, but market increase in ear drop. 2017 at the Crawfordsville location, actually dry matter of the seed of the kernels increased throughout the harvest period, but once again, they saw a slight increase in ear drop as the season went on. So basically the summary of their study was they did not see any evidence of phantom yield loss at all. And so I'll discuss that a little bit more when we get to the summary slide. All right, and then finally, the last topic we'll talk about on this is in 2022, Dr. Peter Kovach, one of my colleagues, did a study on phantom yield loss. He was nice enough to share this data with me to look at. He had some help from some undergraduates there. I've got their names listed just to give them credit. They did all the sampling in this study and did a lot of the data analysis too. But Dr. Kovach gave me the data and I looked at it myself. Basically what they did, they had 6 nitrogen race timings. I'll talk about that on the next slide. 4 replications at each harvest date, or 4 replications of plots, I'm sorry, and 6 harvest dates. And they tried to harvest 2 times a week, and they tried to get there like a week before black layer. And basically they harvested ears. They didn't dry the kernels down, but they did do moistures, and then they corrected for yield at each of those dates. So the next slide gets a little busy here. This is basically a scatter plot of their sampling. So I'll walk you through this here. If you look over here on the right, we have the different color dots. Those are the fertility treatments. So basically the first dot here is we have 100 pounds of nitrogen at V6. The brown dot is 100 pounds of nitrogen at V6, and then 40 pounds at V12, and then so on and so forth. 130 pounds of V6, 130 pounds at V6 plus 40 at V12, and then up to 160 pounds and 160 and 40. So different nitrogen treatments. Dr. Kobach told me he wanted to see if the different amounts of nitrogen and timing would have an effect on the dry down effect of this hybrid, but it really didn't. And the reason I put a scatter like this is, let's just look at this first date. This is an average of the trend line would be an average of the 4 replications. So treatment 3 here, 100 pounds of V6, we have replication 1, 2, 3, 4. So you can just see the data is kind of spread out. There's just a lot of spread in the data. We go from basically 150 bushel up to almost 200 bushels. So highly variable data. I just kind of wanted to show you guys that. Basically, we might see a slight decrease in yield as we go from September 10th to October 10th. But we'll look a little bit more about that at the next slide. Okay, here I tried to summarize it for you guys a little bit easier to look at. So here we have yield on the left axis. I added moisture on the right axis, and then we have date on the bottom again. So as we progress from September 10th roughly to October 10th, yield is shown with the blue dot, moisture is shown with the yellow triangle, and you can see moisture drops from 24% at the beginning of the sample period down to 14%. And yield drops from 180 to 174. These are just linear trend lines. I tried to do some fancier stuff with moisture, but I just couldn't quite get it figured out in time to get it in the talk. But anyway, if you look from the time we're at 24%, if you look at these 2 data points to 15%, we only dropped 1 bushel. As we drop 9 percentage points in moisture. Now, if you look from the whole range, 180 down to 174, down to 14% moisture, we dropped 6 bushel, which would be about 3% in roughly a month. So if you run stats on this data, there was really no significant difference. It does look like there's a trend line that we are losing a little bit of yield as the season goes on, but I think it's more just fuzzed. It's more random error in the model than it is actually phantom yield loss occurring at this location for this study. So phantom yield loss take home, most university research following that study of Purdue, most of the recent stuff seems to suggest that there's no phantom yield loss. There is yield loss that's happening in the season, and I think it's likely a combination of stalk lodging, mechanical harvest loss, dropped ears, and fungal damage that's kind of gradually eating away the kernels. I shouldn't say eating away, but sometimes you get a fungus on there and it causes those kernels to respire, and we don't account for that. A lot of the studies that I've seen are mechanical in nature. So, a lot of I'm trying to think, like the farm magazines will do a study and they'll say they notice phantom yield loss, and they don't really account for shattering loss or mechanical loss or harvest losses. And honestly, that stuff's really hard to measure. It's really hard to see. So honestly, I think, I'm not saying phantom yield loss does not occur. In fact, 2 of you in the survey said that you have seen it. There's weird things that happen out there all the time. It just seems like most research suggests that yield is being lost due to mechanical loss or stalk lodging, things like that. So, but my final point on that would be, if you want to minimize harvest losses, the optimal harvest moisture is 25%. You just got to play the game, whether it costs more to dry it or let it feel dry and maybe potentially lose some there. But anyway, I think I'm buttoned up on time here, so I'm gonna try to go through this next topic pretty quickly. Okay, planting date, my maturity. I've done this for 3 years. If you see there on the bottom, we've done it in Brookings County since 2020. And just to kind of reiterate how we lay this out, we have a strip. It's basically set up as a split strip plot, or however you want to say it. We have 1 planting date. This is the 2020 year. I just pulled a picture from that. So we had April 30, we planted these 8 rows. May 15th, we planted these 8, and then June 1st, we planted these 8. And then in 2020, we had 5 hybrids, and starting at 82, 85, 90, 95, 100 day. And then these are randomized 3 replications back, and then that occurs for each planting date. So the hybrids that we used, thanks to Bayer Corporation for providing these, you can see here on the right, DeKalb 3212, 3588, 4045, 4595, and 5084. That was in 2020. In 2021 and 2, we added a 76-day hybrid, and then the 5084 was swapped out for 5140. So, but otherwise, a pretty consistent group of hybrids through the years. So let's review here quick what we saw. Like I said, I'm going to try to go through this relatively quickly. This is a bar chart, yield on the left. On the bottom, I have the relative maturity for each hybrid, and then each group of bars is a planting date. So you can see in 2020, there was really no difference when you planted your corn, April 30th through June 1st. We had roughly the same yield. And that is simply because we kind of ran out of moisture in 2020, excuse me. We had a very dry August and September. So the first yield date was not able to add yield toward the end of the year. But anyway, I want you to note the kind of the trend. The lower relative maturity tends to yield less than the higher relative maturity. There's kind of a slope from left to right on all of these, right? Okay, quickly moving on. In 2021, we did this study in Volga. Unfortunately, it got very dry over there all year, and we had pretty lackluster result. It's not what we'd want to see for a planting date study. In fact, our best planting date was June 15th, simply because these early planting dates just ran out of water, right? But what I do want you to take home from here is that we're still seeing generally the trend of lower relative maturity corn yielding less than longer season or longer maturity corn, especially in these later 2 planting dates. These first 2 planting dates you can see ran out of water, so I wouldn't look at that data too closely. Is there anything else I wanted to point out? Oh, the moisture content. So even in a late year, you know, plant June 15th, we did get 180 bushel corn from the 101-day hybrid, but it was 36% moisture at harvest. So you do get more bushels, but they are wet. Okay, and finally this year in 2022, I'd say we finally got a year where I saw the results that I would expect from a planting date trial. Unfortunately, we didn't get to the field quite as early as we had wanted to. Our first planting date was May 6th rather than the end of April, so we were about a week behind. And we dropped the 4th planting date because we would have been into the June 20s. I didn't think that was really relevant. So note this year specifically how the earlier maturing hybrids did compared to the late. So very marked difference. May 24th was the best planting date this year for Brookings. Kind of, I guess I'll reiterate that in the summary slide here. June 10th, we still had good yields. Moistures weren't too bad at harvest, but obviously your planting date is going to be probably maximized somewhere in between these 2 dates, May 6th to May 24. Unfortunately, when I summarize this study, the years have been so variable, it's pretty hard to put a planting date, optimal planting date on it. But if we look at yield by relative maturity, this is summarizing all the relative maturities. So again, on the left, we have yield in bushels an acre. On the bottom, we have the relative maturity of each hybrid. And you can see the 95-day hybrid was the best at 199 bushels an acre over 3 years. And this is all planting dates. 101, basically the same thing, the 101-day corn at 198. If we look at percentage yields, basically we're maximizing our yield somewhere in here between the 95 and 101 day for this set of hybrids. And then we start to drop off, you know, 90 days, 93%, and it drops off pretty good. So the early corn, you know, 85-day corn, you're still getting 91% of your yield. I'd say that's pretty solid, but it starts to drop off pretty good after that. And so in summary, like I said, the last 3 years have been so variable, it's hard to quantify the ideal planting date for corn in Brookings County. I think May 10th is early enough to maximize your yields in nearly all years. Corn doesn't respond to early planting date quite as much as soybean does in my experience. We'll look more at that next week with the soybean talk. Plant full season hybrids. I wouldn't push it too hard, but even later in the season, the full season, like the 95+ day corn does well, does better than the early stuff. And we will continue this study again in 2023. And then hopefully I'll have enough to kind of summarize to get an ideal planting date. Really, these kind of studies should be done every year for 10 or 20 years to finally see what a trend is. But anyway, I think I may have gone a little long there. I apologize, but is there any questions quickly?